We're here at the Canadian Museum of Civilization talking to Heritage Minister James Moore about the museum's impending transformation into the Canadian Museum of History. And when you're making a museum of history, you have to decide what story to tell, how to tell it, how far back it goes, and so on. And some people have raised the question, well, isn't this all just propaganda? You know, are we going to get there and find out Stephen Harper invented the telephone? I assume there are safeguards in place.
Did he? Tell me, did he? No, look, the Museums Act, which is what we're going to amend in legislation in Parliament in order to create this museum and give it a new mandate, actually very explicitly says that the Minister and the Prime Minister and Parliamentary, we can't tell the museum what they can or can't show. I can't come in here and say, take that painting down or show that instead of that. I'm prohibited from doing that. What we do is we set out a broad mandate. Then they have a professional staff here and they have a board of directors and a president who make the day-to-day decisions about what they do show. But there's no question there are parts of our history that are controversial. I mean, this was seen actually at the War Museum, or two things actually that happened at the War Museum when it was first created. One was they have Hitler's car. And a lot of people in Canada's Jewish community said, why in the world would we show that? And Jack Granatstein, who was the original chair of the museum, said, well, there are reasons why. It's part of the narrative. And it was very controversial at the time. But they dealt with it, and we had a conversation about it. You deal with the controversy, you move forward. The second controversy they had was the language in which they were choosing to talk about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which led to the end of the Second World War, and the language that they used, which sparked a good deal of controversy. But I think, you know, we're a tough country. We're made of stern stuff, and we can have those kind of conversations. You know, there'll be obviously great debates about how and the way in which we present and talk about Louis Riel at this museum, how we talk about our Aboriginal people, how do we talk about residential schools, Japanese internment, as you said, Chinese head tax. I mean, there are points of Canada's history, even stuff that's more contemporary. The 1970 tax in Quebec, the 80 referendum, the 95 referendum. How do we talk about these things? Yeah, they're controversial, but that's not a good thing. And the fact that we're prepared to debate them, I think, is a sign of our strength.
Yeah, in fact, take Hitler's car as an example. To me, it's an eerie feeling to look at the car and know that this emblem of evil was a human being, that he sweated into that leather and so on, that he was a person, that people are the way this kind of evil comes into the world. And also because we're going to go back before 1867, and there's the existing exhibit on the Aboriginals, we're going to have to talk about the collision between Europe and Aboriginals and the tragedies that resulted from that. And you can't change your history, but by understanding your history, you can change your future.
Yeah, and look, and often with a lot of these questions, the job of a museum isn't to drive a sympathy; it's to create an empathy, right? And so when you just have a dialogue and a conversation about these things, a lot of Canadians don't necessarily approach a subject matter, for example, like residential schools or Japanese internment, and they don't necessarily approach them and just say, "I want to go there and learn about it so I can take a strong stand." Very often, people want to go and they want to learn about it so they can understand it, and they can say, "Well, from that perspective, I get that perspective. From that understanding, I can understand that perspective," and you can understand why things are controversial. Not everything is necessarily driven to an absolute point. I mean, there are truths and there are facts of our history that need to be understood, obviously, and known and learned, but very often our history and the way in which we think about them often depends on your point of view. And just having this infrastructure now, and this is the big point though, is that having a Canadian Museum of History tied together with local museums, we now have the infrastructure to have those conversations. There will never be absolute full agreement across the country on a lot of these controversial questions, but we shouldn't avoid them, and we've been avoiding them for too long because we don't have the institutions. Well, now we have the institutions. Let's talk about them. We're adults. We can have the conversation. Our kids can handle it, and it'll only make us stronger because we talk about it.
Yeah, and from my own perspective, I hope we go back from 1867 back to about 867 to go back into the roots of our liberty in Britain, the Dark Ages, Alfred of Wessex, Magna Carta. I'd love to have Magna Carta tour. We can really get into all that stuff, even if some people are going to come and say, no, this has nothing to do with us. We can at least bicker about it. Yeah, no,
I think that's exactly the right approach. And there'll be a lot of things for this new museum and for its board of directors to wrestle about. I was on a radio show this morning in Quebec, and they said, you know, is Quebec going to be guaranteed a quarter of the foot space so we can talk about Quebec history? And I said, well, I'm from British Columbia. We're 15% of Canada's population. We're not going to have 15% for, like, that's not the way I think to approach these things. I think Quebec's history is Canada's history and vice versa. And the museum will have a lot of these things. But I actually think, you know, when you start having these conversations, for someone who's a passionate, you know, pursuer of books and things about Canada's history, you start to realize that it gets gets exciting very fast when you think about the ways in which this museum can talk about these things and wrestle with these things and think about approaching them and presenting them and debating them. And to me, it's going to be very exciting. You know, this museum has a long history. It was created originally, its pedigree goes back to 1856. It was originally the Geological Survey. In 1968, it was turned by the Liberals into the Museum of Man, very unpolitically correct. Yes, and then it was turned into the Museum of Civilization in '86 before it got its physical new home here in 1989. So this is a museum that has had changes over time, but it's always been building. And I think, you know, we're a G8 nation. We're proud of our history. We should be damn proud of our history because it's rich and very vibrant. And now we'll have a truly pan-Canadian institution to talk about these things.
Right, and you've been talking about the need for debate and discussion, and this isn't just a matter of coming and jeering at an exhibit or clapping at it. Part of this process is going to be consultations with Canadians about what should be included in terms of themes, events, perspectives, timelines and all that.
Yeah, that's right, because it's not my museum, it's not Stephen Harper's museum, it's a Government of Canada museum that we're responsible for in trust for Canadian taxpayers. It's Canadians' museum. And if people want to get involved in that, I really do hope that they do. And if they Google Canadian Museum of Civilization, which is the current name of the museum until we change it through an act of Parliament, Google Canadian Museum of Civilization and you'll see a link there that'll take you to online consultations to talk about the museum and its future. And a lot of Canadians have ideas about what should or shouldn't be in and the kind of narrative that we should talk about. And there's actually a good way to think about it. People who have visited other museums around the country, you know, you can do a chronological pursuit of Canada's history, maybe starting in 867 or prior to that. You can take a chronological, you can take a thematic, you could take a regional approach to the museum. And there are all kinds of different ways that the museum can tackle these questions. And it's a great discussion, and it's good. And now we have a home for it. And we're putting, as you know, as well, a lot of money into this as well. This is a $25 million one-time investment from the Government of Canada. But also as a fiscal hawk I am, and who's done a lot of budget cutting in my department, I can tell you that all the money as well comes from within the existing envelope within my department. So there's no new taxpayers' money. This has all been budgeted before. It's just rearranging the Department of Canadian Heritage, collecting the resources and focusing the Canadian Heritage Department on Canada's heritage rather than just being a spigot for kicking out loans and grants to differing organizations. I think it's a correct course of action for a government heading towards its 100th.
I think it's a terrific initiative. And remember, join the consultations because it's your history and it's your museum. Thanks very much to James Moore, Canada's Heritage Minister, for joining us for this discussion.